So we're talking about critical race theory today, and I want to talk about whether or not the critical race theory is an accurate depiction of history and reality, or whether or not it's a mischaracterization. Can't I couldn't write too much more of a description before the presentation because I hadn't really researched it other than like a few minutes of Googling, and I will say I changed my mind when I did the research because I learned what critical race theory actually is by the people who invented the topic, and then I've learned what people that criticize it say, and I'm going to talk about both the actual version of critical race theory and the critiques, some of which are valid and some of which I don't think are. I also am not the sole arbiter of objective truth, so these are my opinions after doing research on the topic, but you all are here to form your own opinions with your own critical thinking. That's what we do in the FTI. We all think for ourselves rather than dogma and following authority. So let's discover more about this highly controversial theory or hypothesis. I'm not sure which one it's considered. So I think it's a theory. So critical race theory, yeah, it's in the name. So it's an intellectual and legal framework that examines how race and racism are embedded within the structures of American society. It started in the late 1970s and 80s, and it was developed by legal scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. I may not be pronouncing that right. Apologies if I'm not. As a response to perceived limitations in traditional civil rights approaches, particularly addressing systemic and institutionalized forms of racism. So we're going to talk about the core principles of CRT, and then we're going to go into each in more detail. So first is race as a social construct. I have to say I didn't agree with that one when I first read it, and then I researched it more, and I'll explain more what it means. And I'm actually kind of convinced that this is mostly true, based on statistics and data. It basically posits that race is not a biological reality. For the most part, it's more socially constructed than it is biological reality, and that it's used to categorize and oppress people of color. Systemic racism asserts that racism is not just a product of individual bias or prejudice, that it's actually um, a part of legal systems and policies leading to different outcomes for different racial groups when, in a statistically significant way, which we'll go into as well. Interest convergence is the principle that suggests significant progress for racial minorities occurs only when it aligns with the interests of the dominant group. So that's the white Europeans in America these days, or European heritage folks. Like myself, I call myself a European mutt. So I'm part of the majority here, even though I'm, yeah, not exactly, but so I am. So then intersectionality is the next one, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw. And it basically examines how various forms of social stratification, like race, gender, and class, interconnect and impact individuals' experiences at a level that simple generalizations along one dimension don't do. Next is experiential knowledge, which emphasizes the importance of the lived experience of people of color in understanding and analyzing racial subordination. So first, we're going to look at the history of CRT and where it came from. So it was officially organized, as I said, in 1989 at the first annual workshop on critical race theory, though its origins intellectually go back much further to the 1960s and 70s. Its immediate precursor was something called critical legal studies, which was a movement dedicating itself to how the law and legal institutions serve interests of the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the poor and marginalized. We're going to come back to later in the presentation because it's a big deal. Um, Critical legal studies is an accurate it, is accurate that legal matters are only infused with the top 10 to, and I actually had the slide right next is that legal matters are only influenced by the top 10 to 20% of income earners. While you can make an argument that socioeconomic policies for these most successful people economically, I think a conservative would generally say, well, those are the most economically successful people, so those are the ones that should have a voice in legal matters. For economic issues, you might be able to make an argument, although I'll argue in a second that you probably shouldn't. in social and non-socioeconomic legal issues, there's really no good argument to be made to ignore 80 to 90% of the population. Now, even in economic matters, I would argue everybody should have a voice, which creates more socioeconomic fairness. Because when you look at the advantages that people growing up with a lot of money have, um, they have huge advantages over people growing up in poorer backgrounds, not only because of the money that they have, but also the culture that they're growing up in is usually much healthier at the higher socioeconomic strata. In general, right? I like to say the only generalization that's generally safe to make is that generalizations are generally unsafe to make, but I have to make a few of them in order to communicate anything. So we'll make a few. So, but there are always exceptions. So, next we're going to look at the origins of the theory and look at each key part of CRT individually to see whether or not they're supported by the evidence. All right. So race is a social construct. So the CRT assertion is that race is not a biological reality, but a socially constructed concept used to categorize and oppress people of color. It's a central tenet of critical race theory, and the perspective has been widely supported by part of it has been widely supported by contemporary scientific and sociological research, though it has faced critiques and alternative interpretations. So I'm going to talk about supporting and opposing viewpoints of this. Um, so genetic evidence, research indicates that genetic variation within what we call racial groups is actually greater, is actually greater than in between them. So me as a white person has more genetic variation to other white people than we do differences if you take the average person that's white versus the average person that's Asian American or Asian heritage. And what was found is, and this was a 1972 study by Richard Lewontin, which found that 85% of human genetic variation occurs within populations of race, whereas only 6% occurs between populations classified as different races. So you kind of got to get into the weeds to understand that one a little more. But basically, it suggests that the idea that there are and that's well, we'll go into that. That doesn't mean that there aren't differences genetically between races, because there are. It just says that there are more differences with for us as human beings than there are as grouping people together by race. So next is scientific consensus for major scientific organizations like the American Anthropological Association have said that race is not a biologically accurate representation of human diversity and emphasize that humans are not divided into biologically distinct groups, and that the concept of race has been shaped by social, historical, and political contexts. Now, the concept of race has next is the historical context, and race has evolved. The concept of race has evolved over time and often been used to justify unequal treatment and discrimination. While there have been cases of slavery across, within races and across races, in many cases, slavery was used to claim that Black people in America were lesser than the white Europeans, and therefore that's why they should be able to be enslaved. So race was used as a justification for inhumane treatment. Whereas if you look at, well, I'll just say that it has been used for inhumane treatment. And so slavery and colonialism both create examples of that across different, subjugation of different types of races. So those are the examples of sort of historical marginalization of people by race, which, as we said, is a social construct. So sociologically, it's argued that race is a social construct, and that has real consequences, because we're not saying that, and now I'm putting a we here because I've kind of largely bought into the actual view of critical race theory, even though I was actually originally against it before I prepared the presentation. But like the idea is that the social construct of race influences social interactions. That's very real. It influences access to resources. That's been very real. I'll talk about some examples of that later in the presentation. and it affects people's real experiences. And if you ask people of color if they've ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color, they'll say yes. And it goes in all directions. I've been treated unfairly because of my skin color, even though I'm with the majority of Americans. It just depends on the situation that you're in. But in general, the rule is that minorities are marginalized more often than majorities. So that basically aligns with the Thomas theorem, which is if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So next, we're going to talk about arguments against race as a social construct. One is population genetics, which some researchers will argue that while race is a social construct, there are genetic differences amongst populations that correlate with ancestral geographic origins, and that these differences can have implications for understanding the disease prevalence and treatment responses amongst different groups. This is absolutely true. There are, certain diseases that affect certain races more often. I think African descent, folks of African descent have sickle cell anemia more often. And I think if I remember right, it's because it actually helps sometimes combat malaria. Okay, Carrie's nodding, so I'm remembering that right, even though my memory is not the best. So next is medical considerations in clinical settings. Certain genetic markers associated with ancestry can influence health outcomes. For example, the prevalence, and there I have it on my next set of notes. So and then I was going to give that example. So, recognizing the patterns can be important for diagnosis and treatment, although it's crucial to distinguish between ancestry and socially defined race, because, like people could have the same race but be of different genetic ancestry and with different sort of disease exposure and risks. And so, while it's true that there are medical considerations that need to be taken into context for race because of the peril of genetic origins, you can't simply choose race only. You have to look at the genetic the genes over time. So next is a critique of Lewontin's findings. A.W.F. Edwards criticized his conclusion about the similarity and differences between genetics and race, arguing that while individual genetic markers may show more variation within groups, combinations of multiple markers can effectively distinguish between populations. This suggests that genetic clustering can correspond to ancestral groups, although not necessarily to socially constructed racial categories. So, this is kind of a um, I give it a 50-50 in that there's some validity to it, but it doesn't really actually say that his original findings are wrong. It says, some other combination of similar to race, sometimes factors can group people together that often align with race. So it basically still, I think, actually agrees with the CRT argument that while race is a social construct, there are meaningful aspects to genetic origins, and I think we have to recognize that our genes are, what we were born with, and like there are implications to the genes that we have, and so genes make us more or less susceptible to different things. So forensic anthropology basically is the study of trying to determine ancestral background based on skeletal remains. It indicates that certain physical traits correlate with ancestral geographic origins, which some interpret as evidence of biological differences amongst populations. But I would argue you're basically grouping together certain phenotypes, and how meaningful is that at the end of the day? For me, that's not very meaningful, right? How people look is not the most important thing. It's the thoughts people have, and more importantly, the actions that they take that I think define who we are as people. Um,
Hi there.
so what's that?
I do you have that?
I'm gonna mute you, Peter. So the prevailing view in contemporary science and sociology is that race is a social construct without a solid biological foundation. Um, and genetic differences do exist in different populations, but they don't neatly align with traditional racial categories. So recognizing race as a social construct highlights the role of historical and societal factors in sort of shaping racial identities and underscores the importance of addressing systemic inequalities. However, we have to also acknowledge genetic variation within ancestry being valuable in certain contexts, like medicine and anthropology, when used with nuance and care to avoid reinforcing stereotypes or justifying discrimination. So when I first learned about race as a social construct, again, I thought it was actually a little silly, to be honest. And I just assumed race was real. And I think a lot of us kind of do that until we research it more carefully. And that's why I think it's so important to, look into things. And, someone said in the social portion of tonight, like you have to do your own research. And that phrase itself has been misrepresented by some people who don't do good research and say that they've done their own research and come to misunderstandings and say they've done their own research, but they're not open to any possible person criticizing the research they've done. I think when we do good research, which I will post this presentation and all my sources, if anyone can find a reason my sources were invalid or feels like I didn't represent the source correctly, if it is valid, I'm open to that feedback, right? When we do our research, we should allow people to criticize our research and we will have that opportunity. That's why half of the presentation or half of the time in the evening or more is dedicated to Q&A and conversation. And Fred, we do questions at the end, so take a note down of what you want to ask, and then you'll be the first one. You can keep your hand up. That'll put you first in line when the questions come. But just wanted to let you know that it'll be a little while. So um, so race is nuanced and complicated is the answer, and then there aren't really great generalizations that you can make about what we generally refer to as race. So the differences obviously do create different ways that people look, which are identifiable. And it's important to remember that down to our genes, we have more in common as human beings than with each other than we do separating us. And we should stop thinking of people who look different as the other people. And we're going to talk about tribes next week. Remind me to post the link to that. I'm going to try to and try to get it up. But we'll talk about tribalism next week, which is the idea of saying there's an in-group and an out-group, and the people who aren't like me are the other. And I'll talk about when tribalism is good and when it's not so good. And the Cliffs Notes version is it's both. It's good sometimes and it's not good other times. And I'll talk about when for each, in my opinion. So, and ultimately, I think that we should see each other as fellow human beings, and that we'll talk about that. Oh, here I put the link in here. So I'm going to put the link to next week's meetup on tribalism or meeting on tribalism, since we advertise outside of meetup as well. And next is the assertion that systemic racism is embedded within legal systems and policies, and that leads to different outcomes for different racial groups. It's a core tenet of critical race theory, and it's supported by various studies and historical analyses, but also faces critiques, and we'll go into both. So first, we're going to talk about the criminal justice disparities. The NAACP highlights that biased policing and unfair judicial precedents contribute to disproportionate incarceration rates amongst Black Americans. This is not that more Black Americans per capita necessarily go to jail, but it's that for the same number that get put on trial for the same type of thing with similar evidence, I'm pretty sure they went down to that level that more Black people in the same similar situation get incarcerated and for longer than people who are not Black, for example. So that indicates a pretty systemic issue in the justice system that, I don't think has enough attention to it. Um, Educational inequalities is the next thing in Arizona. Policies like English only education and the banning of ethnic studies have been linked to adverse mental health outcomes amongst Latino students, suggesting systemic barriers in the education system. Look, we're in America. I think everybody should really learn English at some point while we're here. I think that's important, but I also think that it's important that if you're part of an educational system, you give people a path to learning English. And if someone comes in at age 8 and doesn't know English already, you have to give them English as a second language, English as a second language as a an educational option so that they can get up to speed on English language. I do think that we should, and when I was in Spain, I worked very hard to learn Spanish because I was living in Spain and I didn't want to be that person that lives in Spain for 10 months and doesn't speak much Spanish at all. So, could I have gotten away doing that? I could have. Do I know people who did it? Yeah, they did. And I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think it's really good to appreciate the culture that you're in, but still be proud of the culture that you come from. So you can do both at the same time. You don't have to choose one or the other. I like to say if I'm given two good choices, I choose both. Um, so, housing and economic disparities, historical practices like redlining and discrimination have led to persistent racial wealth gaps and residential segregation, which continues to impact communities today. Redlining is basically discriminatory practice where financial services companies would systematically deny residents of certain neighborhoods based on race or ethnic group composition rather than on individual creditworthiness. They would deny, for example, a mortgage. So people in like a black neighborhood wouldn't be able to buy a home because they couldn't afford to buy it with cash. How many people can when they're starting to think about buying a home? And so basically that created generational poverty. And so if that is very clearly to me unfair and so talks about systemic racism that has occurred in the past. That should not be happening now, but I haven't heard evidence that it is still happening, but it certainly has happened. Policy analysis, the Brookings Institution um, research indicates that immigration policies have historically treated Latino immigrants more harshly than white Europeans, exemplifying systemic biases in policy implementation. So, I know a lot of people like even we had a recent conversation in the FTI WhatsApp group about immigration or not immigration about traveling and whether or not it's safe to go abroad and then come back to the US. Um, and we were talking about various aspects of travel, and it's complicated these days. It's not as simple as it used to be. So next, we're going to talk about the critiques of systemic racism. So one is an emphasis on individual responsibility. Some would argue that focusing on systemic factors may overlook the role of individual agency and personal responsibility in societal outcomes. I think it's very important that everybody have personal responsibility, but I think it's also important that we ensure society is as fair as we can make it. And looking to give opportunities to people, not because of their race, but more based on socioeconomic challenges, so that those growing up poor still have an equal opportunity to thrive in society if they do exhibit determination and take on personal responsibility. I also think that it's important to remember that if you end up in a court of law, you know, whether or not you did the thing you were accused of doing is like already a decision that was done, right? At that point, you should be treated equally under the law. You shouldn't be treated worse because of your socially constructed race. And even if race was genetically or like originated, that still doesn't mean you should be treated unfairly because of your genes. You should get a fair trial at court in a court of law. So, and we saw that both for immigration and for other judicial sentencing that does not happen today. So, legal equality, critics argue that laws such as the Civil Rights Act and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment provide a legal framework that prohibits discrimination, suggesting that systemic racism is not embedded in the legal system. And I'm sorry, Leah, Daddy's presenting right now. Can you puedes cerrar la puerta? You want to come sit? Okay, sorry, guys. So, we learned, though, that during the presentation on DEI, that DEI is the very effort to prevent systemic racism in organizations, and DEI has actually been demonized by the right these days through mischaracterizations of what it is, which I'm going to argue is what's going on with critical race theory as well. The people criticizing critical race theory are not criticizing what critical race theory actually is. At least the ones that have valid things to critique are generally not just, criticizing what it actually is. So, in many cases, not all cases. But I'm going to go into some of the famous people who are criticizing critical race theory, famous people and organizations. And those are the times where I feel like there's a mischaracterization. These ones that I'm presenting now are actual critiques of actual CRT. And so I'm trying to go over whether or not I think each of these hold water as we go through them. So next is a potential for overgeneralization. There's a concern that attributing disparities solely to systemic racism may oversimplify complex social issues and ignore other contributing factors like socioeconomic status, education, and cultural differences. I agree, we shouldn't really solely blame systemic differences on racism alone. We should look at the disparities more fully, and that's actually one of the tenets of critical race theory. So, is looking at the various factors. So, this critique is actually ironically, a support of critical race theory, although they probably didn't know it. So, policy neutrality, some policy members argue that laws and policies are designed to be race neutral and that any disparate outcomes are unintended consequences rather than evidence of systemic bias. This makes sense to me in that it might be an unintended consequence. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, but you still need to consider that if two people in the same situation are not getting fair treatment under the law, that something's wrong, right? And that's not fair. That's like the very definition of not fair. Two people in an equal situation get unfair treatment is the definition of unfair. So even if it's unintended, it's still happening. And so we still have to understand why it's happening and what do we do about it to make it not happen anymore. And maybe there are multiple confounding factors. Probably there are. I do think socioeconomic is a part of it. I think there are other things going into the outcomes that are seen by the NAACP and the Brookings Institute. But we need to understand it and we need to try, our best. If we want to live in a fair society, we need to try our best to make it more fair. So, um, I also, well, let me leave it at that for now. So, systemic racism conclusion for me is that we learned that there's statistics backing up that the judicial system is actually not doling out fair punishment, giving harsher sentences to people of because of race, and that race is indeed a social construct which is treated as real by people, and that those realities need to be addressed because they have real implications to people and how they're treated by society. Next is the principle of interest convergence. This is introduced by legal scholar Derek Bell in 1980 and posits that significant progress for racial minorities occurs primarily when it aligns with the interests of the dominant group, particularly the white elites, unquote. The concept of a cornerstone, this concept is a cornerstone of critical race theory and has been both influential and contentious. And I will contend a little bit. So, and I'll also agree a little bit. So, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, Bell argued that the Supreme Court's decision to desegregate schools was not solely based on a moral awakening, but it also served U.S. interests during the Cold War because desegregation improved the U.S.'s international image because the Soviet Union was actually critiquing the racial injustice going on in the U.S. And so America, quite frankly, looked bad. And so to look better, it made sense to make the whole country look better to remove racism. Now, I would argue that was the Soviet Union pointing out a fair criticism or critique of the US and the US responding in turn that, yes, it looks bad and yes, it's unfair. And so they changed it. Next is the Civil Acts Right of 1964, which was landmark legislation that coincided with widespread civil unrest and the need for social stability. And addressing racial inequalities helped mitigate domestic tensions and presented a unified front during a period of geopolitical competition. Now, again, I will say that I think the Civil Acts Right was passed because what was going on was unfair, and you had a lot of, quote unquote, white elites that were joining the civil rights movement saying that they agreed that this was unfair. So, while I agree there was alignment, this is a second example of alignment. The third, I would also argue that it was a case where things were made more fair. So third is affirmative action in higher education in cases like Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, where the Supreme Court upheld that affirmative action policies emphasizing on the benefit of diversity of all students, including white students. This rationale suggests that, by the way, that was struck down by the current Supreme Court. This rationale suggests policies promoting racial equality were supported when it served broader interests in the interest of the majority. Um, Third is environmental racism and disaster response. Communities of color often bear the brunt of environmental hazards. So if you look at the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where the predominantly black neighborhoods in New Orleans suffered from delayed and insufficient aid, it also affects this neglect indicates a lack of urgency in addressing crises and predominantly affects minority communities, especially when their well-being does not intersect with the broader societal interests. Now, the Flint water crisis in Flint, Michigan, I didn't know this, that it was a predominantly black city. While residents were exposed to lead contaminated water after cost-saving measures were done to switch the city's water source. Despite clear evidence of contamination, the responses were slow and inadequate, highlighting how the health and safety of minority communities can be deprioritized when their interests don't align with those in power. Next is inadequate implementation of racial equity recommendations in the UK. A Guardian investigation revealed that only about a third of nearly 600 recommendations were made over 4 decades to combat systemic racism have actually been fully implemented. It's a pattern of inaction that suggests without alignment with the interests in the dominant group, efforts to advance racial equality may be neglected or only partially realized. Now I'm going to talk about some emerging empirical studies on interest convergence. So, diversity in higher education, if you look at a study published in 2024 in the Journal of Science, it examined diversity policies in the US higher education institutions, and researchers found that initiatives often align with the psychological comfort and institutional interests of white stakeholders rather than centering on the needs of Black students. So it suggests that diversity efforts may be more about maintaining institutional legitimacy than achieving substantial racial equity. And the study is in the note the slide notes. So COVID-19 vaccination messaging. There was an experimental study that tested interest convergence by framing COVID-19 vaccination messages to align with the interests of white participants, and it found that when public health benefits were presented as advantageous to white communities, support for vaccination increased, demonstrating how aligning messages with dominant group interests can influence attitudes. Again, all the studies are linked. Um, the next is policy making in Nevada. There was an analysis of 5 proposed bills in 2017 Nevada legislature, and it revealed that legislation addressing racial justice issues garnered more support when the benefits to the white majority were emphasized, and it underscores how policy advancements for marginalized groups often depend on their alignment with the interests of the dominant group. Now I'm going to look at some critiques of this theory because I think there are significant holes here. First is undermining minority agency. Critics argue that the interest convergence frameworks diminish the agency of marginalized groups by attributing their progress to the interests of the dominant group. This perspective overlooks the sustained activism and advocacy by minorities that have driven social change. So I would agree with this that activism by minorities is important and needs to be acknowledged. I don't see the goal of saying that progress comes when aligned with the majority's interests as diminishing it, though. It's more a way of explaining about why we can all, like, why when we can all benefit from an fairness and empathize with each other, that it's more likely to happen. So when you put the majority in a position where they can empathize with the minority, they become more empathetic. And that's really, what the golden rule is all about. Although those of you that have been here before know that I like the platinum rule even more than the golden rule, but that's another story for another day. Ask me in the Q&A if you want to know. Overgeneralization of group interests. The theory assumes that monolithic interests are within racial groups, ignoring the diversity of perspective and priorities amongst individuals. Now, that kind of generalization can oversimplify complex social dynamics And I agree with that critique. When you're discussing topics like whether discrimination by race is legal or illegal at a time when racial discrimination was the norm, I think these generalizations were necessary to acknowledge the institutional racism of the time. I still recently heard conservatives advocating that a company should be allowed to hire all white employees, saying that if it's a bad hiring strategy, then the free markets will penalize the company. There should be no legal enforcement. That type of talk, like in a public forum, which it was in a public forum, is very concerning to me because it's a resurgence of the idea that racist hiring practices should be okay. And the very fact that DEI has been demonized when all it's doing is trying to prevent from the inside of companies by a self-audit, essentially, try to prevent what's legally not allowed in terms of hiring practices because of the Civil Rights Act. I worry even more about it because this is a mainstream thing where people's rights are being trampled on, and people are trying to say that racism is okay and trying to bring back racism again. So, um, most of my life, nobody would have said that type of thing. But ever since Trump came into politics, I hear a lot more of this type of talk. So, whether you love him or you hate him, he's definitely brought a lot more of the racist opinions out into the open. Personally, I think that there is a benefit to that in that I think that people that have racist beliefs have misunderstandings, and I think we should hear them out and understand where they're coming from and ask them thoughtful questions that help them realize that they have a misunderstanding, which is something that Daryl Davis, a black jazz musician, has been doing since the 80s with KKK members, and he's gotten, I think over 500 KKK members to turn in the robes, including the head of the KKK being one of them. So I like his approach. I try to copy it. That's why I started asking more questions and trying to make less assertions, although sometimes I still catch myself using the logic hammer. So, um, lack of falsifiability. Some scholars contend that the interest conversion principle is difficult to test empirically. If all instances of racial progress are interpreted as aligning with white interests, the theory becomes unfalsifiable and loses explanatory power. Now, I don't really get how that, like, okay, so you can identify whether the majority's interests align each time with progress against when progress toward against racism is made. Like if you basically like take every situation where progress is made and you say were the majority's interests aligned, yes or no, you're either aligned and they move forward and progress is made, or they're not aligned and progress is made. So I don't understand how it could be not falsifiable, which means that you can't prove it definitively either way. This is very falsifiable to me. Next is neglecting. If anyone has an explanation for why people believe that, I would love to hear it. So, neglecting moral in the Q&A, neglecting moral progress by focusing on self-interest, the theory may discount genuine moral or ethical motivations behind the support for racial equality amongst members of the dominant group. This perspective can be seen as overly cynical and dismissive of altruistic actions. And I do think that um, there is a level of disenfranchisement that comes from saying, the minority can't make progress without the majority's interests aligning. And I think it would discourage the minority from taking action against unfair things if the majority's interests were not aligned. And so I don't like this part of CRT because I feel like it prevents people from trying to fight for what's right even when, just because a particular situation isn't met. I think we should always fight for what's right, is what it comes down to. And I think, I'm going to try to give, uh, I had some examples where the interests of the majority did not necessarily align and progress is still made. So I don't think this is like a like fully validatable aspect of CRT. So we've seen a lot of interest where cases align and some cases where they don't align. So the examples are all anecdotal. I think really I'd like to see a systemic analysis. I looked for a meta study on this of interest convergence on major areas regarding racial progress to see if there's a statistically significant difference on whether or not progress is made when interests align or not. It does kind of make sense intuitively, right? If you can get the people in power agreeing with something, then it's more likely to happen. And also given, sorry. So also, given that we learned that only the top 10% of income earners are the ones that matter according to the legislation, the elected representatives, it sort of makes sense that, given that white Americans are generally the majority of the top 10% of income earners, that that actually does get explained by the socioeconomic differences, not necessarily the race-based differences. So there's a little bit of compounding going on there. So it is starting to be studied. I showed a few studies about this topic, but I think it's somewhat well supported, but I also think there are valid criticisms. So next is intersectionality, which is a term coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It's an analytical framework that examines how various forms of social stratification, like race, gender, class, and sexuality, interconnect and impact individuals' experiences. It emphasizes that these identities are not independent of each other, but they intersect to create unique models of discrimination and privilege. So let's talk about the support for intersectionality. It recognizes the complexity of identity, right? If you take it looks at the multiple overlapping like aspects of a person and makes them real. So if you have a black woman may face types of bias that are not solely based on the fact that she's black, but also that she's a woman. And that's a combination of race and gender. So that those situations are very real because black women face different types of discrimination than women of other races and even than black men. So that perspective addresses the limitations of the single access framework that considers only one aspect of identity at a time. And interestingly, some of the critiques of critical race theory supported this, as I mentioned earlier. So it's fun to watch the critiques actually agree with the hypothesis or the theory in this case. Um, I I kind of wonder if it's a theory or a hypothesis, but it's called a theory, so we'll call it that. So legal and policy implications. Crenshaw introduced intersectionality to highlight how legal systems often fail to protect individuals who experience overlapping forms of discrimination. In cases where Black women face workplace discrimination, courts sometimes dismiss their claims by treating race and gender separately, thereby overlooking the unique intersection of both. There's an influence on social movements. Intersectionality has informed various social justice movements by promoting more inclusive approaches. It encourages activists to consider how different forms of oppression intersect, and that leads to more comprehensive strategies that address the needs of diverse populations. Um, Academic and research applications. The framework has been instrumental in fields like sociology, gender studies, and public health. They use it to look at overlapping identities and how they impact outcomes like healthcare access, educational attainment, and economic opportunities. Now let's look at some studies validating intersectionality. One is a systematic review a systematic review that analyzed 65 US-based studies that it was a meta study that applied quantitative methods to investigate health disparities through an intersectional lens. The review can be found that while intersectionality provides valuable insights, many studies face challenges in fully capturing the complexity of intersecting identities, and common limitations include narrowing the scope of intersectional groups studied and overlooking the underlying mechanisms contributing to health disparities. So, what it's trying to say there is intersectionality may be even more complicated than the way I presented it. There may be more factors and so many factors that it's hard to study. And well, life is hard, right? And reality is that trying to study something complex is going to be hard. I like to say that the most of the things worth going after in life are also hard. The easy things usually aren't that important, although sometimes they are. So there's exceptions always. Intersectionality and quantitative research, a systematic review of another review of 707 articles published between 89 and 2020, incorporated intersectionality into quantitative research, and it highlighted increasing adoption of intersectional frameworks across disciplines, particularly in psychology, sociology, and medical sciences. But it noted that studies struggled with methodological challenges, such as adequately integrating theoretical frameworks, and developing innovative methods to capture the nuances of intersecting social positions. Again, it's difficult. Um, in mental health research, there was a systematic review focusing on women's mental health, that the intersection of gender with other social advantages like socioeconomic status and race significantly increased the risk of common mental disorders. The study emphasized the importance of considering multiple overlapping social factors to understand and address mental health disparities effectively. Lastly, is in machine learning in healthcare, there was a recent study about socioeconomic status and race and sex and how the three interact to influence schizophrenia diagnosis rates. Using logistic regression models, researchers found that increased socioeconomic status was associated with a higher probability of schizophrenia diagnoses in Black Americans, but acted as a protective factor for white Americans. These studies underscore the necessity of incorporating intersectional perspectives, developing fair and equitable AI tools and healthcare for healthcare. So next, critiques. So complexity and practicality. The critics say, well, this is really complex. And like I said, it is complex. And in fact, it's so complex that even the people trying to study it now aren't even doing the best job because it's that complex. Does that mean it's not worth going after? No, because intuitively it's real. Like you can just intuitively know that, we are not simply, I am not just a white person. I'm also not just a male. I am a white male, and the things that impact me as a white male are going to be different. And then if you add all the other confounding factors in people's lives, well, these things all play into what's going on. Now, um, with the advances of technology, like it will become more and more realistic to sort out the many different possible hidden variables, or is what they're called, is things that could be influencing the future. Um, right now, there's not there hasn't been a silver bullet created that does it. Potential for divisiveness. There's concern that focusing on differences amongst individuals may fragment social movements. By emphasizing distinct experiences, it may inadvertently create divisions rather than fostering unity. I'd say it's important to both recognize our differences and remember that we're all human beings. Remembering that we're human gives us more in common with each other than to differ about, but also recognizing our differences in a positive way and also in a way that's seeking truth and trying to be fair, which is what I mentioned is the first intention of the FTI. When we're trying to seek truth and be fair, and we're using our knowledge about people's differences to do it, I would argue that's a good thing because we're making society more fair for everybody. And so recognizing unfairness across any perspective that it exists, that is practical, is important. And we want to eliminate that unfairness as a part of our society. So another one is not only is it complex, it's hard to measure. Um, Quantifying the effect poses a lot of methodological challenges in studies because of the nuance of intersectionality, and we kind of talked about that. But I'll just go on to the next one. So misinterpretation and misuse. As it's gained in popularity, there have been instances where the principles have been misunderstood and oversimplified. Some applications of the framework reduce the framework to a checklist of identities, neglecting the deeper analysis of systemic power structures that Crenshaw emphasized. There will always be people that misunderstand and misapply things. And I like to give an example of some modern Christians. Christ said we should love everyone, even our enemies. But some modern Christians express hate towards immigrants and gay people, for example. The current pope and the last pope both said it's okay to be gay. So, maybe Christ actually thought it was okay to love everybody. And if you say including your enemy, that means everybody. That does not mean you have to have dinner with them every night. It does not mean you have to spend all the time in the world with them, but at least have some compassion for people because the ones that we dislike the most are probably the ones suffering the most. I like to say everybody deserves love and compassion. The ones we think deserve it the least are the ones that need it the most. So try to keep that in mind when someone pisses you off the next time, pardon my language, but they're probably someone that's going through a difficult time or having bad things happen to them on a regular basis. And maybe it's even their fault, but they just don't realize it. So that doesn't mean just because modern Christians think that you should hate, some modern Christians think that you should hate immigrants and hate gay people, that Christianity is bad. It means that some modern Christians have a misunderstanding of Christianity's teachings. So luckily, this is being corrected by the current and last pope, as I mentioned. And I also think that it's important that we not diminish, the value of people who taught for fairness, like Christ was one of the people in the world, Christ, the Buddha, um, the Stoics, Epictetus, a lot of people in history have taught that we should be fair to society, to all of society, and at least what they considered the important parts of society in their time. Because I go back to the Stoics, there was a lot of slavery back then. So, but anyway, I'm digressing. So next, let's go to a summary on intersectionality. I think it is a valuable lens for overlapping social identities. It is important to recognize, but it's also important to realize that we're not at a point where we can fully understand it, but that it's worth trying to understand how the implications of intersectionality on legal and social outcomes. And and so I think that the studies gave pretty convincing evidence that it is real, it should be taken into consideration, but also that it's complicated and needs to be studied further. Next is experiential knowledge. We're getting near the end of the presentation here. Sorry, it's a lot of slides here. So it's foundational concept, emphasizing the importance of lived experiences of people of color and understanding and analyzing racial subordination. The perspective asserts that firsthand accounts provide essential insights into systemic racism that traditional academic approaches may overlook. So, for example, I'm actually just going to give an example off the top of my head. Like some people say, well, you should always have every approach to studying be, racially blind. Well, if you did make every study on the fairness of the judicial system racially blind, you would never know that there were actually major racial disparities in the justice system. So you have to start from a hypothesis that you hear individual people saying that this is happening, and then you analyze those assertions and see whether or not they hold weight, hold water. Illuminating systemic racism, CRT scholars would argue that marginalized individuals reveal the systemic racism that they see and feel in their everyday lives that are embedded in laws and institutions. That uncovers a pattern because as it's raised by the voices of people of color that feel the discrimination is happening, it gets then studied and either validated or refuted. And so that to me is about listening with an open mind to what people have to say about their lived experience. Now, it creates a more comprehensive understanding of racial injustices to understand it from the individual's point of view rather than just to say we're going to ignore what individual anecdotes say. Now, anecdotes should not be used to prove something, but anecdotes can be used to raise an issue in the first place to try to look for things to study. So I agree with that it does illuminate systemic racism, and we should listen to everybody's perspective with an open mind. That's part of the second intention of the Freethinker Institute, after transparently sharing our opinions with other people, which is the other part of the second intention. So next is counter narratives to the dominant discourse. Experiential knowledge is a counterbalance to the common social narratives that marginalize and ignore people of color and their voices. And the fact that, you know, basically this just gives people a way to poke through sort of the general underlying assumption that, I've heard people say there is no more racism, right? And it's like, well, really? Because, I definitely see things that are racist going on in society. I don't think it's the type of racism that we had in the 50s. Like, it's definitely much more muted than it was then. It's much more subtle than it was then, but it still exists. And it might even be unintentional in a lot of the cases. Sometimes I think not so much. But most of the time, I would argue it is unintentional. That doesn't mean it's completely gone. So listening to the experiences of people of color and also of people not of color, if there's discrimination against the majority, that can happen too in cases. But I think we should listen to individuals' voices and use that as things that we should study. That's how you come up with a hypothesis. As someone said, "Hey, I think this might be a problem," and there's your hypothesis. So Next is enhancing educational practices. Um, and that using it in an educational setting can make for a more inclusive curriculum that reflects diverse perspectives. And that promotes critical thinking and empathy among students, encouraging them to engage with complex social issues more deeply. Lastly, is addressing epistemic injustice, which is about taking experiential knowledge and combating epistemic injustice, where certain groups' contributions are undervalued or dismissed. And by validating those experiences when they happen, we move closer to a more equitable and fair society, acknowledging diverse forms of knowledge. So some challenges. There are challenges to the objectivity, basically saying that prioritizing personal narratives may compromise objectivity. While I agree that that's an important point to address, I think that the narratives should be validated scientifically before they are spread, super widely. Like taking an anecdote and spreading it widely without any good evidence that that's a regular recurring issue, that's not, I don't think that's, like a good idea to do, basically. But I think using anecdotal issues to come up with things to study and then studying them and seeing whether or not they are systemic rather than an exception to the rule is important. Um, so, um, Next is potential for anecdotal fallacies. Um, I think that I kind of just addressed that. It is a very real critique that I think narratives should turn into studies um, before they're widely spread, because otherwise you end up just passing along anecdotes which may not be statistically like accurate, right? They may be a misrepresentation of what's going on. Um, the risk of marginalizing other forms of knowledge. Some scholars express concern that emphasizing experiential knowledge could inadvertently devalue other epistemological approaches like empirical research or theoretical analysis. I think that people creating the studies in this space should be aware of that so as not to fall into this situation. But I don't think that that's likely to happen because scientific studies are generally not formed on anecdotes, they're formed on statistics. And you kind of have to do some sort of statistical analysis for most studies to get peer reviewed and accepted into journals. So next is diverse experiences within groups. Assuming a unified perspective of individuals of color may overlook the diversity of experiences within the communities. Critics caution against homogenizing narratives that might not account for variations in socioeconomic status, geography, or other intersecting identities. I agree with this point completely, but I don't think that this aspect of CRT is calling for homogenizing people's background solely based on race. It's just saying that we should listen to an open mind with people's lived experiences and consider whether or not their perceptions of racism might be real or not. And if they are real, we should do something about it to stop that from happening. So, summary, the emphasis on experiential knowledge offers valuable insights for the lived realities of marginalized groups, enriching our understanding of systemic racism. It's also essential to balance that with other forms of analysis so that we take a comprehensive and nuanced approach. And recognizing the strengths and limitations of experiential knowledge allows for a more inclusive and critical examination of social structures and injustices. I don't see this as an area in itself that will have statistical analysis. Rather, I see it as a way of coming up with topics that should be studied. So now I'm going to go through a couple of famous organizations and groups. So far, I've addressed each of the criticisms one at a time, and some of them I think held water and some not. I'm going to do the same thing here. Basically, there is perceived labeling of white people as oppressors. So critics contend that CRT categorizes individuals into oppressed or oppressor groups solely based on race, suggesting that all white people are inherently privileged or complicit in a systemic racism. And I've also heard people say that it makes white people feel guilty for being white. I did not get any sense of any of that when I was reading about critical race theory from sources that actually think that critical race theory is real. I only see this in the voices of people who are criticizing critical race theory. So this one I didn't think held any merit. I tried to look for examples of people who advocate for critical race theory using the words oppressor or oppressed, and I didn't find anything. So I think this is a mischaracterization. Um, Next is educational impact concerns. There's an apprehension about including in the educational curriculum because students might feel guilt or shame. I mentioned that in the last slide. Critics argue that it could create a divisive atmosphere in classrooms, undermining unity or mutual respect among students. You know, I just didn't see any evidence that critical race theory was trying to make people feel guilty for being white or being in a majority. I got the sense that the literature was trying to alert us that there may be unfairness going on in our society and that we should be aware of that unfairness and try to make it more fair. I think it's really trying to like put a spotlight on the lived experiences of people that are statistically validated by studies that seem to be being either ignored or not taken seriously. And so I think the reason that CRT was thought to be a good thing to put in the educational system is to make people aware that we do have these systemic inequalities and we should try to be more fair as a society. Next is concerns about reverse discrimination. Some people feel that CRT's emphasis on systemic inequalities may justify discriminatory practices against white individuals in the name of achieving equity, potentially leading to policies that prioritize race over merit. I did not get any sense that CRT was trying to advocate for reverse discrimination. It was more trying to learn where marginalized people are being marginalized and trying to, again, make it more fair for everybody. Next is associating with Marxist ideology. So critics often link CRT to Marxist principles, arguing that it replaces class struggle with racial struggle, thereby promoting a worldview that pits racial groups against each other and undermines individual agency. I found it interesting because this is something that I'll get into discussions with conservatives sometimes. And as soon as they don't like something, some people just have this knee-jerk reaction to say, that is either socialist, communist, or Marxist. And then immediately the whole conversation ends. It's like I forget the rule that is like how long does it take before someone calls someone else a Nazi in a conversation? And there's some funny like, rule for that. If anyone knows it, mention it in the Q&A. But that's the same thing that I feel about calling something Marxist. Now, essentially, while I actually think that I think this is a straw man fallacy because people try to compare something that they don't want to hear to something that it isn't. CRT was nothing like Marx's manifesto. I read a good part, if not the whole manifesto, and basically, I will say that class warfare I definitely think is going on. The fact that only the top 10% of income earners are even given the time of day by elected representatives, that's class warfare right there. Like that, and the fact that now we have a funding bill that's going to give, huge, huge tax giveaways to billionaires and actually going to, in the end of the day, lower disposable income from middle and lower classes. Um, that's class warfare right there. And that is happening. But Marx's arguments defending like what class warfare is and how it works, I think were very flawed. I mean, he may have been innovative for his time, but with a modern lens looking back, he had some very, very flawed arguments. So that said, we might, if anyone likes Marx, maybe we could do a separate event on that. But um, a critique of the manifesto, but I don't know many people, in spite of so many conservatives I know saying that's Marxist or that's socialist or that's communist. I know very few people that are actually socialist, communist, or Marxist. That said, I feel like the critiques of CRT that say this didn't really take any time to understand it. Um, and I also like to say, when the logical argument is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser, which is a misattributed quote to Aristotle. He didn't actually say that, but it's a good quote, whoever said it. So now we're going to look at a few. Now is the time we're going to look at some famous people's critiques. And I'm sorry, I'm past 8. I'm going to try to go quickly. So Fox News said a quote of a history of CRT, and it quoted one of the founders as in as CRT being a vague and not understood concept. And then it went on to assert that in the fallout of mass confusion, many have focused their criticism on what they say CRT manifests, which is divisive ideas about race, collective guilt for dominant groups, and assigning racial significance to seemingly neutral concepts. So, I I don't see how recognizing that there's unfairness in society is any of that. And so I guess I should keep in mind that Fox News itself said it's not a news network, it's an entertainment network, and that it doesn't need to be factual. But I was curious, so I clicked on another news article, and it basically tried to assert that CRT said that there's a teaching that there is no objectivity in math. And I looked up what that struck me as odd. Like, of course, there's a right and a wrong answer. Two plus two is four, right? Now, I looked up what they meant, and what they were trying to say is that it's not about, um, you shouldn't have the focus on teaching math be about finding the right answer, but more about what is your process of getting to the right answer, and how do you logically think through it? And that I thought is a really good point. And they picked and chose, one quote out of a 120 to 150 page toolkit to justify and vilify the idea of critical race theory, which seems pretty desperate if you ask me. And not really listening to understand at what CRT is. Um, so next, I'm going to talk about Christopher Rufo, who's one of the people who has been instrumental in bringing CRT into the public discourse. He argues that it's a form of identity-based Marxism. I'm not going to go into this again in detail because we kind of covered it, but he yeah, so I'm going to skip that one. We're late. So next is I'm going to skip that, go to the Heritage Foundation. And it basically contends that it's fundamentally destructive, asserting that it violates American civil rights laws by promoting differential treatment based on race. And they have developed toolkits to help parents and community members oppose CRT in local school districts. And I wanted to listen with empathy because that's what I try to tell other people to do. So I really tried to look up what do they mean by that. And they're trying to say that it promotes different treatment based on race, which they're saying that there are oppressors and oppressed solely based on race, and that it determines the principle of uh, that it undermines the principle of equal treatment under the law. But actually, everything that I have read about CRT is about looking for equality under the law. So there's a lot of, misunderstanding, I would argue it, and I'm going to assume it's good-natured misunderstanding. And I think that, you know, these folks should be talking to people who actually support CRT and trying to listen to understand in the way that I was trying to listen and understand what their perspective was. I couldn't find anything in CRT that was actually aligning with these people's critiques. So, I will say the overarching principles of the Heritage Foundation, I saw a lot of merit to, which is the stance or commitment to individual merit and equal opportunity, free from racial categorization. They argue that that's the principles of the heritage actions, the action, and they would argue that an emphasis on systemic racism and group identity detracts from those principles, promoting a worldview that they feel is divisive and detrimental to social cohesion. And I would argue that they're actually fighting against their own commitment to individual merit, equal opportunity, free from racial categorization. So I find it really interesting that they're making that argument because they're basically saying we believe this, and we're going to criticize the people who are pointing out when these things that we said we believe are not true. It's a whole level of mental gymnastics that's really hard to follow. So, I do applaud the Heritage Foundation for those goals, but I think that they have a misunderstanding about what CRT really is. So, really, I think ultimately the critics and the proponents of CRT are aligned in that they both want fairness. And so, if we let fairness and seeking truth be our North Stars, like we do in the FTI community, I think we could actually get both CRT proponents and critics to align behind these banners of truth and fairness. And that's what I'd like to see, to be honest. And I'm gonna put I'm gonna put the slides in the thing, and I'm gonna start to take questions. And I'm sorry that I ran long. Mike, how are you?
Sorry about that. Yeah, here
All
I
right.
am. I didn't really have a question. I was just gonna, I was
Comments are fine
prepared for
too.
folks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, comments are fine too. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was thinking about, and your organization sounds good, and I liked your presentation. And
Thank you.
full disclosure, I was on the board of the ACLU for 10 years, and we do support critical race theory, and we're fighting against efforts to ban it in the schools, and we're fighting that in court. I thought, I thought you did such a great job. This is probably not necessary, but I was looking at, I was trying to find an example of critical race theory that everybody could just kind of understand if we wanted to get kind of a case study. This
Hmm.
is more about systemic racism, that aspect, and it's in the justice system. And it's about the disparities in sentencing guidelines for crack and powder cocaine. So on the face of it, it's race neutral. But what people are talking about when they say systemic racism is that it's things that are on their face race neutral, but in fact have just disparate outcomes. So
Sorry,
somebody's
I got that.
okay.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you. Yeah, they begin. uh, so I just, I think everybody can understand what we're talking about. But I thought the history was kind of instructive, and also I was a little surprised, but pleasantly so, that the Trump administration, by their action or perhaps inaction, endorsed the idea of systemic racism, that it does exist. So what happened was there was a law passed in 1986, and it set the disparity at 100 to 1. It's called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine carried the same sentence, minimum mandatory sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine. Then there was a recognition that that was a bad thing. And there was an act in 2010 called the Fair Sentencing Act, and that reduced the disparity to 18 to 1. In 2021, the Justice Department, under Merrick Garland, and more specifically in December 22, he set forth guidelines that they would no longer enforce it as a disparity. But in the middle of all of that, there was a law um, called the First Step Act, 2018. This is the one where Trump's involved. It made the First Sentencing Act retroactive, the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, which allowed some individuals sentenced to under the original 100 to 1 disparity to seek resentencing. So that was great.
Hmm.
So there's a bill called to reduce or remove the disparity completely. It passed in the House, but it has not passed in the Senate, and it remains it's kind of dead in the water. And I'm not sure that it will move forward in today's Senate. But that's an example. So basically, I don't have data on whether Trump has returned to the 18 to 1, uh, because, I mean, on the face of it, they just supported the idea that 18 to 1 that 100 to 1 was bad. And folks under that should be able to seek redress. So for all we know, Trump thinks 18 to 1 is about right. But in any case, I don't have an update on that. But I just wanted to give that as an example, sort of a really practical example
Yeah.
of something that looks racially neutral, but is not, and to help those, I think folks are pretty informed, but to understand that uh, it's not accusing individuals of racism. It's just saying that it's built into the system. So thanks.
And just to make sure I understand you, Mike, I think what you're saying is that crack cocaine, which is a drug usually used by minorities, had much like more difficult sentences than the white elite
Yeah,
snort it up your nose cocaine. And
yeah.
that's I just don't know if that was
Thanks
clear
for
to everyone,
filling
so I
that
wanted
in. I
to
mean, I assumed everybody kind of knew that, but yeah,
yeah.
crack cocaine is used in the black community,
Sorry,
and
I
powder
assume people
cocaine
don't
is
know as
used by.
much about drugs as I do because I grew up in a place that they did a lot of drugs. So yeah,
Well, I know about drugs policy, but yeah, crack cocaine is very much used by Black people much more than. And so, thanks for filling in that
yeah, but
gap that
thank
I
you for
had
the point,
left
Mike.
out.
And also forgot, and this is not a criticism of you, Mike, but generally when we have people raise hands, we want to try to keep it to less than 2 to 3 minutes. But I'm really glad Mike went through all that, so totally
Sorry.
fine.
Yeah.
It's actually my fault tonight. Usually we have plenty of time to talk, but I talked too long tonight, so I'm going to try to be quieter. But yeah,
Let's
thank
get,
you for those comments. And
yeah, let's give some
um,
of the folks a chance now. Great.
the other thing I want to quickly say is if you want to respond to what someone just said, feel free to just speak up, but then keep it to less than 20 seconds, and then we can have like a conversation about whatever each person with their hand up brought up as a comment or question. Both are welcome comments or questions or alternative opinions to what I presented, whatever you want.
You
So
got
And I'd like to ask Mike a clarifying question before
please,
I go, if I could.
yeah, you got
Mike,
20
so
seconds.
yeah. So
I know
if
Carrie. Hey, Carrie.
yeah, dude, good
Good.
to see you. So if discretionary immunity and all of that stuff and rational basis, this was not overturned, this disparity. So what was the argument given in the first place to justify it, if you know?
Well, it's not an argument that was made in court. It's an argument that
Nobody
does not have to meet a
challenged
legal
this
standard.
ever on being an improper or you know what I'm
Not that
saying?
I'm aware of. But I mean, maybe you can find somebody who did, but this is not a court challenge.
Yeah, no, it seems odd to me that this was never challenged. And I mean I could counter it by saying something like LSD had incredible sentencing minimums as
Well,
well.
you're fighting you're tilting at windmills because it didn't happen. So I know you're prepared for me to say it was in court and then make that kind of argument,
No,
but it
no,
wasn't.
I
So
don't know.
yeah, yeah.
I would assume somebody would have challenged it, but that's
On
what
the larger question, would you agree that's an example of systemic racism?
I don't know. I'd want to hear what the actual argument given to support it was, because it could have potentially racist effects without it being motivated by racism. And that gets down to plausibility, which is a different argument.
Well, policy, I know you're a lawyer, but policy arguments are not legal arguments. And this is a policy argument.
Yeah, but you got to look at the
We can't reduce
policy.
everything to law. Sorry.
All right. All right. So I'll get going here and
Yeah.
try to make it quick. I think that calling this a theory is a little bit of a misnomer. My guess is that it's trying to give the air of scientific legitimacy to something that is really sociology, which struggles to be hard science, but it's not. It's more of a postmodern critique or maybe a lens. And I'm not saying that there's not any legitimacy in viewing the world this way, but it's illustrative. It's not like factual, where you can exclude other forms of analysis in lieu of this, where you say, this is how we should look at the world because this is the truth. That's not what you get here, right? Because I can look at various, I don't know, forms of prejudice, and I can talk about cultural prejudice, racial prejudice, sexual prejudice, age prejudice, looks-based prejudice, height-based prejudice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can't say one is more important than another because it's contingent on the individual at a particular time and place. Maybe age is the most important in one circumstance. Maybe it's not race. Maybe it's race in another circumstance. Maybe it's weight in one other, right? I mean, there are studies about, queering the Bible and looking at, Jesus through a lesbian lens and things like that. And I think that's great. You come up with some interesting stuff that way. But I don't think you can say that the Bible was like a queer manifesto or something like that and say that it truthfully was that.
So that's not what I said. And I don't think that's what CRT is saying. I'm curious why you think CRT is saying that race is the most important thing in every scenario. Is that what you believe it says?
I think what it is that so academia often is a solution looking for a problem, if you know what I mean. This is like the p-hacking phenomena. And I think what it does is if you want to use a critical analysis, kind of this postmodern way of looking at things, you need to open yourself up. And it is a subtle point because it's like saying, I care about breast cancer. That doesn't mean I don't care about pancreatic cancer. But
Yeah.
if I'm just saying no funding for any other kind of cancer other than breast cancer,
Right.
Now I'm kind of moving it into where I'm prioritizing it. And it seems
Agreed.
like
But
a lot of the voices are really focusing on the race aspect and not the overall question of all kinds of bias.
well, I mean, I guess so. I think what you're saying, but you're kind of arguing against your own point. You said if I care about pancreatic cancer, then it doesn't mean I don't care about other kinds of cancer. All CRT is doing is saying I care about, racial, sex discrimination, and the other things that we included, socioeconomic discrimination, and this combination of things.
Mhm.
Nothing that I've read about any of this said that they're excluding anything from that. They're just saying these are things that we know are a problem and that we care about. But if you, Carrie, want to, talk to Kimberly and say, hey, Kimberly, can we add in XYZ? She'd probably take your call, my friend. So,
Of course, that gets into the grievance studies as well. This idea where you can find these things if you're primed to find them, and a plausibility. Like if I'm pulled over, I could think it's because I'm a man. I could think it's because of my race. I could think it's because of my age, and it might be true, or it might not.
So the one about hearing anecdotal voices, I agree with you. The other ones are scientific studies that are, have controls and,
Mm,
they're carefully looked at. So I
mm,
don't think that that is true. Like if you look at the drug sentencing that Mike was talking about, like there's a very clear disparity. Maybe not the one that Mike was talking about, but the ones that are cited in my sources, there's a very clear disparity of same people, same situation, you're one race, you're in a lot of trouble, you're another race, you're not so bad off. So would you
yeah,
agree if
no, I have
that's
no, I have
true?
no argument there. That's
Yeah,
that's all true. That's
Yeah,
really well documented.
yeah,
And the thing about whether you're sentenced before or after lunch, I mean, there's a
yeah.
whole bunch of stuff
No,
like
that's
that.
another one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no arguments there. Thanks.
We should give snacks at court. Um, so then it'll be more fair. If people don't know about this, there was a study showing that like judges have, I think it was like harsher sentencing right before lunch and like lighter sentencing after lunch, if I'm not mistaken. And it's like, well, if the judge is hangry, then they're giving worse, worse penalties, right? So that's why I joke that we should give snacks at court, and it's only a half joke. Like we probably
you
should let the judge eat during court, then we'd
uh,
get better outcomes.
you can
But
find it in Wikipedia. It's called the Hungry Judge thing. Just look up Hungry Judge. Yeah, snacks for judges. I'm down for that.
I think the judges would agree too. It could be publicly paid snacks. I'm
Yeah,
okay with that. If it makes a fair justice system, I'll put my tax dollars to work right
me
there.
too. I'm there.
You said for US aid for judges. Um, so, so sorry, it was a bad joke. You guys know I liked US aid. But it was a black humor sort of thing. Fred, go ahead.
I just had a couple of very minor um, corrections to your slides, and then
Sure.
one more general observation. First, I may have misheard this, but I think you said that we share 80% plus genetic material with other races, something like that.
No, it's about the disparity, and I'm struggling with I looked into it in detail, and I didn't explain it well, so it's not your fault. But basically, what it showed is that there is more genetic variation within races than across races. Meaning, if you take the genetic variation either within a race or you take the genetic variation across races, that there's actually more, we have more differing within a race than we do across races.
Right. I thought I heard that number between races. At any rate, um, the number is actually 99.9% shared genetic material between
Correct.
one race and another race. However, that's misleading, as is all these genetic arguments are misleading because the vast majority of genes are workhouse genes. They encode for proteins that do basic metabolism like glucose processing and the like. However, there are the differences between races are very superficial, very little difference. But there are a handful, a very small number of differences that make enormous differences. in phenotypic expression, and you mentioned malaria, sickle cell anemia, which is actually a single point hereditary mutation of one gene that causes this. And considering that there are 3 billion base pairs, that's a very, very small difference. It makes a very, very big difference in phenotypic expression. But I think your main point is correct. The differences between races are really superficial,
Yeah.
relate to skin color and the like. Secondly, regarding the connection between CRT and Marxism, there is a definite connection. CRT came from legal critical theory, which came from the critical theories of the Frankfurt School of Marxists, self-identified Marxists. This isn't just casting a label. This is the Marxism of Lukács and Gramsci and Horkheimer and Adorno and so on and so forth. There is an important school which explicitly tried to recast the Marxist critique in terms of race. However, you could very well make a point that current practitioners of CRT don't particularly know or care about its roots in the deep, dark history of Marxism. So it's really kind of irrelevant at that point. But you might look at the history of CRT in the Frankfurt School, and that's not very important, I think, to the gist of your discussion. Perhaps what's of more interest is the the practice of CRT, which is where people have the most objections. In particular, CRT tends to express, it proposes that there are broad aggregate differences in outcomes based on race, and it seeks to address it oftentimes by kind of heavy-handed, centralized restrictions, censorship, regulation of individual and organizational behavior. That's what people more generally object to.
Can you cite a source for that assertion? And um, you know, I would be curious. I forgot to say also in part of our norms here is we try to stick to one topic per time that people raise our hands, because I kind of wanted to address your Marxist connection thing as well as this, and it becomes too much to try to handle more than one topic at a time. But you can raise your hands as many times as you want. But let's address the.
Let's postpone that and we'll come back to it. I'll raise my hand again. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. But then maybe let's address the first one of and that'll give you time to look for a source if you could on the way that CRT addresses race. And the other one though, when you said that it's connected to Marxism, what do you think is left of Marxism in CRT? I mean, I get that there are origins related to it. There were the people that wrote about CRT talking about socioeconomic disparities were influenced by Marx in a small way and the Frankfurt School in a small way. But like that's because Marx was kind of one of the first people to point out the class struggle. He was yeah, he was one of the first people to really do it in a meaningful contemporary way. But what do you think is left of Marx in CRT today?
Well, maybe we can come back to that because that's actually the other point that I was going to raise that relates to that topic
Okay,
in terms of practice.
great.
So
So
if you
I'll
want
look
to
forward
circle
to,
back, I'd like to hear what other people have to say.
sure. I'll look forward to hearing your response on both of those when you get back. But put your hand up again. I'd love to hear those answers. Michael, how are you?
Well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great.
I just want to add something about crack versus powder cocaine.
Hmm.
I remember back then there was this fallacy that was actually held as truth by many people that crack turned the users into wild-eyed, remorseless, violent criminals. people believed that, and they considered it a fuel for violent crime because they associated black people with the higher propensity for crime. And they think they acted like this just was jet fuel for that tendency. And that was a fallacy, and it was very, well, of course, it was wrong, but that was a belief that was widely held.
Yeah, no, good point, Michael. I remember that as well. Um, I actually didn't know that was not true until you just pointed it out and I fact checked it. So, um, yeah. So it was probably a pretty commonly held misunderstanding.
Yes.
So thanks, Michael. Mandy.
Um, Hello. Oh my
Hi.
gosh. Sorry about that. So CRT, it only applies to countries where the ruling class is white.
No, not necessarily. I think it would apply to any country with a minority that's being unfairly discriminated against. I
Okay, so
could
I'm
be
gonna have to
wrong.
look for
Let me
an
fact check myself on that, Mandy, because
yes,
I could be wrong, but
yeah. Because my understanding is because I could understand how CRT is annoying, because it's because racialized people already know all that, right? Because they live it day to day. So the CRT is only to inform white people that, hey, look, this is what you're doing. And I think also with CRT, the other word always gets put in with it. I don't know. I mean, from what I've observed, is rep. Oh my god, no wonder I have a problem saying that word. Reparations, because CRT and reparations somehow always end like sometimes when CRT is mentioned, reparation is also thought of as well. And
I
reparations
didn't
for
see any of that, Mandy. I think you may be seeing critics of CRT
yeah,
that are putting those two together when they're
yeah,
not.
they're putting they
Yeah.
yeah. So like I said, like I can see how it becomes an issue because people assume CRT is also reparations for slavery, and reparations for slavery was paid. Reparations were paid, and paying for the reparations ended in 2015. But the thing is, who did they pay the money to? They paid the money to the slave owners, and that ended in 2015. Reparations.
Yeah, I think the idea of reparations is now thought to be reparations go to the people who were enslaved rather than the slave owners. But um,
Yeah, but that was only 2015 that ended. That they finished paying that off.
why do
So
you think there were slave reparations paid in 2014?
2015.
No, you said it ended in 2015. So why do you think that there were slave reparations paid in 2014 or 2015? Can you cite a source for that, Mandy?
Yeah, it was there was a thing that came out the Treasury in the UK. Yeah, I'll see if I
Yeah,
can find it. Yeah,
if
yeah.
you could
The
cite a
Treasury.
source for that, I think that would be very surprising to me.
Yeah, no. It happened. So that was
Sarah? Also,
sorry, I can hear feed.
you're living?
I just muted him.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying, that I can see that how they would have issues with that. With CRT, because the racialized people already know that this is going on. They're living it day to day. There's a fantastic book that just came out by Keon West as well, The Science of Racism. And that's fantastic. He was on PBS Story in the Square, Public Square, I think, in that thing. But he has some fantastic data on racism. But that's
And
all. Yeah.
And I did fact check myself, Mandy. CRT can absolutely be applied in a country with a white minority where the whites are unfairly discriminated against. It applies equally. It's not focused on the the makeup of the US today. It applies to any country where a minority is being unfairly discriminated against.
Okay. But it was created in the US in 1970.
Correct. Correct. So
Okay.
they were looking at it from the context of their country, pretty much
Yeah.
everybody that does anything looks at it in the context of their country. But it's not meant to only apply to the US. It was just invented here, but it applies everywhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Yuri, Привет.
Привет. Yeah, I don't know, like feel free to stop me if it feels too weird, but I'm I'm kind of like try to invite everybody to step back and look at the bigger picture here. Like this is a philosophy group, so we should know about this allegory of cave, Plato's cave allegory, when people live in a cave. That's all they know until someone like manage to find a way out, and then they come back and then try to wake everyone else back, and that's when things don't go well. So this is, I think, if you what happens if you look at the life in a cave. It's pretty complicated. Like the society, the power dynamic in a cave. You know, you can write volumes about it. There's all these interactions between prisoners and guards. Like who gets what benefit, what poster you can put on the wall. There are a lot of efforts put into making cells better, more livable, prison cells more livable. But and you can create studies and theories about how people live in the cave. But all this is ultimately will be unsatisfying, because the purpose is to leave the cave. Is not to, like, yes, we can make life in the cave better, and yes, we live much better. You can arguably say that we live better than we lived 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But fundamentally, it is still not the society that worthy of human being. And no matter how better all these incremental changes we make in it, it will still be fundamentally flawed. So that's what I think, what people feel about critical race theory or many other theory. Even Aristotelian logic is also, people can find frustrating, because they read it, they try to figure out, and it feels like it will leave them wanting, and that's again, that's a good thing, because eventually it would point us to this idea that this is not the issue. Something is really wrong with this world, and we need to figure out what it is. And actually, it's not even that hard to figure out, but I'll leave it here. The truth is simple, but get
Can you
it.
describe what you see as out of the cave and in the cave in this scenario with critical race theory?
Well, that's the point. It's not about race or anything. Like, um, I'm reading a book, and it's about psychoanalysis and psychology, and philosophy. And Sigmund Freud, he has like this idea of or concept of becoming individual, for lack of a better word. And he sees that becoming individual is a psychological achievement. It means that it's not a given. Like, many people, they are yet to become individuals. They're like proto-individuals. And Freud also spent so a lot of time looking at this society that consists of proto-individuals. He wrote a whole lot of mass psychology, and it's not a pretty thing, mass psychology. So he basically says that, like, as long as we live in a society of proto-individuals, we'll have all these kind of conflicts and power imbalances, and we have the power hierarchy, which we shouldn't have in the first place, which is not a This this is the way to make a society of proto individuals work, to allow us survive in this state. But again, the goal is to find a way to help everyone. And by the way, Socrates tried to do that, Jesus tried to do that, Freud tried to do that with psychoanalysis, is to find a way to help everyone to become an individual. And when we will become a society of individuals, that will be a totally different game. That when we will leave the cave, and that when all these problems, all these squabbles, petty squabbles that we have now, they will just go away because we will be different people.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it necessarily means that we'll be different people, but I'd like to think a better world is possible, one in which fairness is almost complete, really, where every human being is getting treated fairly under the law and by fellow citizens of the world. And so that's what, for me, being outside of Plato's cave looks like. Now, you know, to get outside of Plato's cave, there might be three layers of cave, right? And one might be what critical race theory is going after now. One was in the 1950s, and you're really peeling back layers of the onion, in a sense. Um, so, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I interpreted what you were saying.
Oh yeah, like I think in the end, like when when everyone will realize that we all in this together, that you cannot be happy when other people are sad, you know.
We shouldn't.
So
Some people are, right? And we
yeah,
shouldn't, though, right? We
mhm,
should be compassionate if someone else is sad, right? So,
yeah,
uh,
and it's not like even compassion. It's about basic understanding that compassion or not, you're not going to be happy when other
mhm.
people are sad. You're not going to feel secure in the world when other people don't feel secure. No matter how much money you make, no matter how powerful you are, you will feel afraid. You will fear for your life when other people are in this situation. So your task is basically is to find a way to make everyone happy, and you will be only as happy as it's kind of like kind of like in a family. You can only be as happy as everyone else. You cannot, like, your partner isn't happy, you won't be happy. Your children are unhappy, you won't be happy. So we just need to find a way to extend the same dynamic to the whole world, to the everyone in the world, you know but that requires, you cannot simply like say, oh, let's do that. Let's do this. It it takes quite a bit of spiritual, personal, intellectual growth to internalize this concept. I think
Specific.
maybe yeah, welcome.
Michael, go ahead. Fred, go ahead.
Okay, getting back to the examples, I think the question was, what is the support for the notion that it's the implementation of critical race theory that's often considered the problem, and it shouldn't take much effort to consider that, because all you have to do is talk to others or look at the news. But in terms of polls, for example, I saw that in a meta report by an educational um, uh, site, and then drilling down into that educational site's meta poll of 20 other polls. It showed, for example, is fairly consistent on questions like how much um, should public schools teach about racial inequality. The respondents indicated that it should be that more people, 34%, should teach about racial inequality versus 25% against. So people are definitely, the parents, I should say, definitely would prefer that there's some discussion about racial inequality and racism. But for CRT, according to the poll, and this is also indicated in a St. Louis University poll in Missouri, the breakdown is schools should be allowed to teach critical race theory. 51% disagree and 37% agree. Schools should be allowed to teach about how racism can exist in society and its institutions. 38% disagree and 48% agree. So there's a difference here between the discussion and teaching of racism and the discussion and teaching of critical race theory, which and the problem lies in the heavy-handed, centralized, administrative, censorious implementation, oftentimes, of critical race theory that oftentimes opposes what parents of children want.
I have
And
a quick question, Fred. Do you think all the people who answered that poll actually knew what you guys all know tonight about critical race theory?
well, that's a problem. These are people who, first of all, there are quite a few people who don't know what critical race theory is.
Correct.
And these polls, at least the one that I read, was among those who said that they consider that they know what critical race theory is.
I would have said before I did the research that I knew what it was too, but I didn't. And I'm a
Well,
fairly
let me
smart guy, to
give
be
you
honest. You know,
let me
like
give you
I'm
let
not
me
trying to
give
toot
you
my
an
own horn here,
example.
but
Yeah, let me give you an example, and you can explain how this relates to critical race theory. Critical race, first of all, it's a very amorphous concept, and I don't think anybody has a single definition of CRT because it morphs depending on the self-interest of the CRT actors, opponents, and proponents. So it's so amorphous that you can't pin it down. So let me give you an example. My niece is an elementary school teacher, and she considers herself a liberal, perhaps even an activist, and progressive. She went to get her master's degree in education, and she attended a class. She claimed that the main thrust of her postgraduate education was CRT influence, and she gave us one example that her class was told how Pippi Longstocking stories were racist, that they're based in racist colonial stereotypes. And her first reaction was, "What? You know, these are stories that I loved as a child, that my students love." And her grade in graduate school, a renowned educational graduate school, was determined on their ability to find racial biases in classic works that are taught in elementary schools. So she and the parents of the students that she teaches, as much as they appreciate the problems of racism and the like, they would tend to say that maybe these somewhat biased, according to professors who are steeped in CRT, maybe these biases that only they can discover are worth tolerating if the alternative, as it is in her case, is insipid, boring textbooks for children that are so whitewashed that neither the teacher nor the students have any interest in them. So is that an
I think what
example?
you're
That's
saying
her.
is
She's okay. She's getting her graduate degree in education.
right,
She's a liberal, and this is what she thinks about CRT.
right.
So
But I
is
think
she mistaken?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Oh, and because you have better information that she does as a graduate student in education.
She's a graduate student in CRT. Her specialization is racial studies.
Well, I see we're not going to get anywhere, but
No,
she
I'm just asking you, like, does she really have more credentials than me? You know, like, has she studied racial studies?
I can give you any possible example, and you would find some disagreement because, as I said, CRT is such an amorphous concept that it can be twisted and turned any which way. I'm just saying that according to polls and according to people that I see, people that I know, even good liberals that I, even Black people that I know, just ordinary people, look at the ridiculous extents that are taken with CRT and want to back off and say, okay, let's let the pendulum
I
swing.
was one of them, Fred. Before I researched it and before I looked at what it really is, I was one of them. I thought CRT was going overboard, creating this oppressor and oppressed thing. People have a misunderstanding of what CRT is. They don't fundamentally understand it, and it is not amorphous. Like it's not super well defined as there is a dictionary definition for it, so you can look it up. You can also look up the authors and you can read their work and you can get summaries of their work, which is what I did. And the summaries of their work compared to the critiques of CRT are night and day different. I believed the critiques because that's all I read when I first Googled it and started looking into it. It has much better search engine optimization. So the marketing on behalf of the people vilifying CRT is way better. They're far better marketers than the CRT proponents. But the actual ideas that have merit are the CRT ideas. And I presented them tonight, Fred. So if you disagreed with anything that I prevented, that I said this is what CRT is, tell me where you disagreed and why.
Well,
But
I did. I said is in the implementation. The problem is that it's a result-based aggregate criteria that if a race suffers from an aggregate bias over history, then it should be addressed by a centralized authority which imposes their own notions of standards on individuals and schools and communities. And that, I would argue, is what is objected to for the most part.
where did I present that there's a central authority that should be enforcing CRT? Can you
Oh, I
read me
said
that
that.
part of the
I said that
presentation?
that was not part of your presentation. My point
I
was
didn't see
that
any evidence that that's what it is. Fred, that's what the
well,
conservatives
never
are
mind.
saying it is.
The poll I gave you the polls. I gave you an example, and
I know,
I'm
and I'm
pretty
telling you,
sure
the people who took the polls probably don't know what
are
CRT really
stupid
is.
because they didn't see your presentation. Okay, got it. Thanks. Bye.
So Carrie, go ahead.
All right, let's see if I can do better. Okay, so would I be correct in saying that one of the successes of critical race theory is identifying systemic racism in the United States?
That is like identifying and resolving it at the root cause so that there is no longer systemic racism. If I were to channel what the goals are, and I think that when people write stuff, they should say what their goals are. People don't do that.
Mhm.
If the founders of the Constitution had said, "What's the purpose of the Second Amendment?" we wouldn't be having these arguments these days, right? Like they
Well,
didn't
they
give
kind
all the
of did, but
rationale.
that's another argument. Oh boy.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to digress us, Carrie. Sorry, I know you
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I could
No,
digress
no
a lot,
worries.
but
No, you get
but
me fired up on that topic. We'll
I
be here
know,
all.
right? But like we might agree more than you think on that one.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
so, um, so I, I'm sorry. Say your point again. I
So
did
what
digress.
I'm just trying to, iron it out that it's like,
Oh,
okay, you've
yeah,
got
let me
this
say,
study,
I think
CRT.
the
It's
goal is to prevent systemic racism. That's the goal, right? And so
okay,
if we prevent systemic racism in the United States, then CRT no longer is useful or meaningful in like you can still teach about it if you want, but like it's teaching about it in the way that we teach about slavery, right? We
sure.
don't have like modern slavery in the US in any quantifiable significantly form. Although this data shows that there are more slaves now than there were in the ancient world in the world, but that's because humanity has far more people. It's a far smaller percentage of the population that's enslaved. So not to discount like the horrible experience that someone is going through if they're going through that, but we are in a better place where slavery is not legal, it's not acceptable, and it's, but so someday the goal of CRT is that someday CRT will become obsolete and no longer applicable to the modern world, right?
Okay,
That's what seeking fairness is about to me.
because I'm not saying that what their analysis is false. I'm just saying it's not necessarily true in a factual sense. It's illustrative and it's designed to highlight. Because, like the judicial bias that you notice, there's a few different kinds, right? There's the one where the judge is hungry. That's just individual bias. That's got nothing to do with race. Then you've got what Mike brought up with the sentencing differences or disparity between crack cocaine and, powder cocaine,
Yep.
which may or may not be racist, right? Because somebody else could say, well, I'm going to come from the attitude that the legal system is biased against white hippies. Hence the even more radical penalty for LSD than for crack cocaine. Right? Now, does that mean that it wasn't racial bias for crack versus cocaine? No. It's just we're throwing stuff in a pot, seeing what rises to the top and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is kind of a challenge for the CRT folks, because I do think, everyone that's making academic claims needs their feet held to the fire and say, hey, how do you deal with this? And let's evaluate you on those merits. But when I look at something like, I just did a search here, I used ChatGPT, so you can recapitulate my results. But it was 2023, the median household income in the US is about 80,000 a year. And then broken down by race, whites, it's 89,000, blacks, it's 56,000. Sounds like a hell of a bias, right? And then you look at East African immigrants, and it's 84,000. Kenyans, 93. They're doing way better than the white folks, right? A lot of people bring up Asians, and I see a lot of folks that are kind of pushing the systemic racism angle, kind of like to dodge that one with the white adjacent thing, which I don't know. But Somali immigrants are down at 46. So it's like, boy, there's a big difference between Kenyans and Somali immigrants in the US here, and it's got nothing to do with their skin tone, I would guess.
Yeah, and that's part of what I think CRT is trying to talk about is that, race as we talk about it is just a social construct, right? And while there is bias based on race, it's saying, in intersectionality that there are more factors that we need to look at, but the people who are looking at it, Carrie, are having trouble studying it because it gets so complicated so quickly. And so you're bringing up a good point, and I agree with you. And all I would say is we need to look at what are the situations that are preventing fairness, and we have to
Mhm.
attack those. And
Absolutely.
I
We're in
think,
total agreement there. I think
yeah,
anybody who comes to the table should
exactly.
be willing to, with endure the slings and arrows of criticism.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree with you that the academics should be criticized. Their feet should be held to the fire. I think if someone thinks that the studies of racial discrimination or like not, and again, it wasn't necessarily saying that it was intentional racial discrimination. It was just saying there was a difference in outcome by race
Mhm.
in judicial situations where there were apparently similar situations. If someone wants to try to do another study and show that that's not true, a skeptic should come up and create a study, right? That's what
Yeah.
academic journals do. You find a skeptic that doesn't agree with those findings, they try to run their own study and repeat the experiment, and if it doesn't repeat, then maybe it's not real. But I haven't
So
seen that.
real quick, I just
Yeah,
on the point of genetics, and then I'll shut up.
yeah,
Great Danes and Chihuahuas share 99.9% of their genetic material, but nobody thinks that they're not distinct dog breeds, right? So, I mean, when we get into the genetics, it gets really complicated
that's
really quickly.
Yeah, that's why whoever was like adding the correction, like while he's right that humans have 99.9% the same
Yeah.
genes. I agree with you, but like what the study showed was a very different thing, which is that variation within race is different, that is greater than variation like across races. So
Yeah, and I think that percent that they were quoting, the 60%, was only applied to only that 1% that they're talking about. Like it was only they were only talking like of that 1%, they were talking about the percent of that 1%.
probably true, Darlene. Like she's saying that the genetic variation is only the genes that vary, right? We're not talking about the variation between the genes that don't vary, right? Because that doesn't make sense. It's talking about the variation between the genes that do vary. So yeah, I think you're right. And we're gonna go a little over because I talked a long time and I'm pretty sure my kids are already in bed right now, so I should probably talk quieter. So um thank you, Carrie. And I think we agree on this. It sounds like I think we both agree that the things that I presented that CRT is doing, which I believe are what they're doing based on my research, are good things to strive for. And I probably agree with Fred that some of the implementations of CRT are probably very bad because I think people have this Pippi Longstocking kind of perspective where they take a good idea and they take it overboard so that it becomes so extreme that it's bad. And I think we have to be careful of that. That's what happened to me to political correctness, is it became you had to be walking on eggshells and not be able to clearly communicate yourself even in a polite way. And then correctness got a bad name for a good reason. And it's still there's a good purpose to it. But anyway, Howard, go ahead.
I mean, just want to make a general factual point. I looked at someone mentioned the reparations from Great Britain. I just did a Google. Something way more interesting happened. I remember John Oliver Carnick remarking on this in one of his diatribes. The British finished paying off their slave owners in 2015. Apparently, when they banned slavery, a whole bunch of people had millions and millions of pounds worth of chattel, or whatever you want to call it. And the British felt they had to compensate these people for it. And they're not clear what they have. I presume it looks like they sold bonds or something like that, and the stuff only got paid off in 2015.
Yeah. Mandy shared the link for that. She said that, and then I was like, Mandy, show me a link. And turns out Mandy was right. So
Yeah,
slaveholders in Great Britain?
so this article
slaveholders are all over.
The
and I checked,
slaveholders are all over the place.
it was slaveholders in Great Britain, Mandy. I'm pretty sure it was of the British Empire anyway.
Wait, William Gladstone's dad apparently got a hell of a lot of money, got a couple £100,000.
I thought slavery was outlawed in Britain before the U.S.
So it was, but what happened is the loan was taken out in the late 1800s, and the loan apparently was only recently paid off. And the way that people found out about this was through some low-level government worker probably running a social media thing, and they said, "Congratulations, we finally paid off those reparations we paid to slaveholders in the late 1800s. Don't you feel good that your tax money went to that?" And a guy responded, "Hell no!" Like, no, I don't feel good that we just paid that off. Like, 200 years later.
Compensation Act is 1837, but I mean, I mean, we were horrified by slavery now, but they dodged the Civil War back then. So, what would you pay to not have the U.S. American Civil War?
Yeah. No, I get the point. I think it's kind of sad that someone would write something on social media sort of congratulating for that, like that. I don't know.
I think that's the point. We forget about the supremacy. We forget about the colonizers who are really actually running the show, because we're all pawns in this.
Well, I would argue that
and the CRT, yeah, fine. We know that this is what's happened, right? We know about slavery. We know, but the British or the colonizers, they all know it. They all know it too.
But Mandy, whoever that social media person is, they're a pawn too. Like, no one would post that without being completely unaware of what they were posting. Like,
so so if they're all pawns in this, they know not what they do.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know what they do because they have major misunderstandings. We all have misunderstandings, and that's why the first intention of the FTI is to seek truth, not to be right or to seek to be right. If we seek truth and fairness first, that heads us in absolutely the right North Star direction.
Because in England, if you bring up CRT or anything like that, the first thing they're going to say, well, if you don't like it, go back to your own country. Right? That's always the answer. Go back. And the thing is, if we go back to our own countries, we're not going to have to deal with racism. but then I mean, that's another program for you. Thank you.
Yep. Yuri, do you mind if we let Sunny go before you, and then those will be the last two comments? Just
Yeah,
because
of course.
Sunny hasn't, I don't think has gone.
Yeah, Garrett, thank you. I just wanted to say this was so helpful. And my only thought I had is CRT being so controversial. Is it really important for a person to know about CRT to be a racist? Obviously, no. And in similar fashion, if you want to address racism, you don't need CRT. So, that's a kind of going to the core issue of, holding people accountable. Sometimes, these frameworks sound great in academical institution. We kind of feel like, wow, we're so smart, intellectual. But really, on ground realities are so different. There are people who have no clue about CRT and they are racist to the core. And the opposite can be also a solution without even knowing about CRT. Those aren't just my comments, general comments. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Sunny. I think the idea of CRT is to try to create a systemic approach to identifying where there is unfairness in society and where there are power in inequalities that are resulting in unfairness. And so if you look at it in that lens of, the goal is to seek fairness, which is what I got from everything that they were doing, um, then it's hard to disagree with. Now, again, I'll agree with Fred's point that I think some of the implementations of CRT and maybe some of the teachings of CRT might not have been, aligned with that, but I haven't seen any evidence that they weren't. So if someone has examples of things that were taught in schools that are showing oppressor and oppressed in a textbook, I would love to see that because maybe that would change my mind and say, oh no, CRT really is using this because here it is in a student's textbook that can be validated with the Library of Congress, PDF of that book. So, all I can say is that when I researched what CRT was from the perspective of the people who support it, I didn't see that language used anywhere.
Yeah, just a quick the main point is like, we understand, like, let me give you an analogy. Like, we know the benefit of marriage counseling, right? If there is an issue, marital counseling is helpful. But definitely we don't want marriage counseling from Hugh Hefner. So, that's the thing. Some of these individuals are not really have a good motive in promoting these theories. Sometimes we got to kind of dig deeper and see who these individuals are. Sometimes they just, promote certain things and then they're corrupt to the core themselves. It sounds like a fantastic thing to promote, but some of these individuals who are promoting this are corrupt on both sides. I'm talking about those who oppose this as well as those who support it. They're corrupt to the core, which has nothing to do with the theory itself. Hello, hi.
She is not asleep, so I have to go soon. But I want to let you finish, Sunny, and then I want to let Joella go. And I'm sorry, Yuri, but we're not.
I'm done. I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Sunny. Joella, go ahead.
Oh, I thought Yuri was before me, but
He was, but he's spoken a few times and you haven't. So I wanted to give you a chance, and then we're gonna have to shut
yeah,
down. I got to get this
yeah,
family
just
to sleep.
yeah, great presentation, by the way. It's very complicated. I just think critical race theory is coming from the point of view for those who have experienced some form of systemic racism, discrimination, and just for have other people to understand where it's coming from. It's not to say, oh, to make people feel bad about themselves being white, but it's something that somewhat, well, what Carrie said, which I didn't really fully understand, was the comment about like, I think you said something about Somali immigrants coming over. Uh, my parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, came from the 60s, and they came because of they wanted better educational opportunities, which were not present in their country, and educational advancements. And most times, even like when you see people from Nigeria, um, they steadily do better than people from the country that they're that they're actually going to immigrate to, because the value of education, in my opinion, is not taken for granted. You know, they value the education more because it's something that's hard to attain. Education is seen in, especially in immigrant populations, as a way to advance in your career or, you know, to socially. So I don't know. I don't, and also Black people are not monolithic. You know, there's many cultures, you know, there's many, you know, so I don't know. I didn't really quite get your comment, but I just wanted to.
I think you were agreeing with him, Joella. If I can be fair, is that Kerry was pointing out that nuance that, Somalis, don't do as well in the US, and Kenyans do better than the average white person. And so that there's not a monolith. And I think intersectionality agrees with both of you, which is to say that there are subgroups, right? But if you break everyone down to an individual subgroup of one person, you can't study them anymore because there's no more statistics. So we have to make some generalizations in order to create insights. And so the trick lies in making enough generalizations to be explanatory to predict what, or to be able to analyze what's going on and predict the future with some degree of certainty. If we don't change it, and then how do we change the future so that it'll be better and more fair for everybody? And so, um, yeah. So let Fred, sorry, Yuri, I'm going to let Fred make one more comment because I made a few comments towards him, and I hope I want to give him a chance to respond for that reason. Go ahead, Fred. We can't hear you, Fred, if you're talking. Oh, I think my computer just, yeah. Hold on. It's got it.